Imagine the dream. To leave it all behind, to disconnect from the noise, the traffic, the relentless pace of the modern world, to build a life with your own two hands, surrounded by the profound, quiet beauty of nature. It's a dream of freedom, of self-sufficiency, of peace. A life off the grid. For thousands, this dream becomes a reality. They find their sanctuary in the remote corners of the world, miles from the nearest neighbor. A quiet life in exchange for the chaos they left behind. But the dream has a dark side. What happens when the comforting silence is broken by a sound that doesn't belong? What happens when you realize your isolation isn't a shield, but a cage? In a place where there are no streetlights, no police sirens, and no one to hear you scream. What happens when you discover you are not alone? Tonight, we explore 3 true, deeply unsettling accounts from people who went looking for solitude and found something else waiting for them in the quiet, untamed wilderness. Our first story comes from a man named Ben, an Army veteran who, in his late 40s, decided to build his off-grid dream cabin in the remote mountains of northern Idaho. He bought a 20-acre plot of land that was accessible only by a long, winding dirt road. It was perfect. For over a year, Ben worked tirelessly, building a small, self-sufficient cabin. He installed solar panels, a wood-burning stove, and a system for collecting rainwater. By his second winter, he was living his dream. His days were spent chopping wood, maintaining his home, and exploring the vast wilderness around him. His only companions were the deer, the elk, and the profound silence. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, easily dismissed. Ben had a small, locked supply shed about 50 yards from his cabin, where he kept tools and non-perishable food. One morning, he went to the shed and found the heavy-duty padlock unlocked and hanging from the latch. He was meticulous about security. He knew he had locked it. He checked inside. Nothing was stolen, but a few cans of beans were slightly out of place. He felt a prickle of unease, but attributed it to his own forgetfulness, a simple mistake. He replaced the padlock with a newer, more robust one, and tried to put it out of his mind. A month later, it happened again. This time, the padlock wasn't just unlocked, it was gone, and a single can of peaches was missing from the shelf. This was no mistake. Someone had been on his property. Someone had picked a commercial lock twice, taken a single insignificant item, and left. It felt less like a theft and more like a message, a quiet declaration. I can get to your things whenever I want. Ben's military training kicked in. He began doing perimeter sweeps of his property every morning. For weeks, he found nothing. The deep snow of the Idaho winter covered any potential tracks. The feeling of peace he had worked so hard to build was replaced by a low-grade, constant anxiety. He started carrying a rifle with him whenever he left the cabin. It was during one of these sweeps that he saw him. Ben was on the western edge of his property, looking up at the high rocky ridge that bordered his land. The morning sun was bright against the snow. He scanned the ridgeline with his binoculars, a daily habit. And there, standing among the snow-dusted pines, was a figure. A man. He was too far away to make out details, but he was wearing heavy, dark winter gear and was perfectly still, looking down towards Ben's cabin. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. This was miles from any public trail. To be there, the man would have had to hike for hours through treacherous terrain. He watched for nearly 10 minutes, a silent standoff across a snowy valley. Then, the man turned and melted back into the trees. The sightings became a regular occurrence. Every few days, Ben would spot him, sometimes on the western ridge, sometimes to the east. The figure never got closer. He never did anything. He just watched. Ben felt like a specimen in a jar, his every move observed by an unknown, patient entity. The isolation he had once cherished now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. The climax came during a brutal blizzard that trapped Ben in his cabin for 3 days. The wind howled, and heavy snow buried his home. There was no way anyone could be out in this weather. On the third night, the storm finally broke. The silence that followed was absolute. Ben was stoking his wood stove when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, coming from outside his front door. It was the sound of someone methodically knocking the caked snow off their boots on his porch steps. Ben froze. Every muscle tensed. He grabbed his rifle, his mind racing. He crept to the small, thick window next to his door. He wiped the condensation from the glass and peered out. The watcher was on his porch. He was a large man with a thick, matted beard, his face weathered and grim. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking up at the sky, his expression calm, as if enjoying the break in the storm. After a moment, he turned his head and his eyes locked directly onto the window Ben was peering through. He looked right at Ben. He showed no surprise, no aggression. He just held Ben's gaze for a long, terrifying moment. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the snow-covered darkness. Ben never saw him again. But the man had made his point. He wasn't just a watcher on a distant ridge. He could get to Ben's porch in the middle of a blizzard anytime he wanted. The man hadn't stolen anything of value. He hadn't tried to break in. He hadn't uttered a single word. All he had done was systematically destroy a man's dream by stealing the one thing an off-grid life is supposed to guarantee: peace. When you live deep in the wilderness, you become an expert in the language of the land. You know the call of every bird, the rustle of every animal, the groan of trees in the wind. Our second story comes from a woman named Alyssa, a former biologist who built a small, off-grid homestead in the dense, ancient forests of the Appalachian Mountains. Her terror came not from a human intruder, but from the sound. A sound the forest should never, ever make. Alyssa's first year on her homestead was idyllic. She documented the flora and fauna, kept a garden, and felt a deep connection to the woods. She knew its rhythms, its music. The first time she heard the new sound, she was sitting on her porch at dusk. It was a faint, rhythmic clicking. It was sharp, almost metallic, but also organic. It sounded like a giant insect, but it had a strange, resonant quality that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It came from deep in the woods, lasted for about a minute, and then stopped. As a biologist, her first instinct was curiosity. She tried to identify it, searching online for insect or animal calls native to the region. She found nothing. The sound returned a few nights later, Closer this time. Click, click, click. It was always rhythmic, always with that strange, deep resonance. Then, she noticed a change in the forest itself. The area around her cabin grew quiet, unnaturally quiet. The birds stopped singing in the mornings. The squirrels and chipmunks that used to dart across her yard vanished. The nightly chorus of frogs and insects went silent. It was as if every living creature had fled, leaving a pocket of dead, silent air around her property. The only sound that remained was the rhythmic, metallic clicking that would start up without warning each night. Her scientific curiosity had soured into a deep, primal fear. This was not a natural phenomenon. One evening, the clicking was louder than ever before, seeming to come from just beyond the tree line at the edge of her clearing. Armed with a powerful flashlight and a can of bear spray, she decided to confront her fear. She stood on her porch, aimed her flashlight beam into the impenetrable darkness of the woods, and yelled, "Who's there?" The clicking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, watchful. And then a new sound came from the darkness. It was a deep, guttural hum, a low-frequency vibration that she felt more than she heard. It grew in intensity, making the wooden porch beneath her feet tremble. The hum was accompanied by a strange visual phenomenon. Faint, non-luminous lights began to move through the trees. They weren't like flashlight beams or fireflies. They were described by Alyssa as pockets of mobile darkness, shapes that were blacker than the surrounding night, that moved with a fluid, intelligent purpose. They weaved between the trees, always accompanied by the deep, vibrating hum. She was witnessing something utterly alien, something that had claimed this patch of woods as its own and had driven out all natural life. She backed away into her cabin, locked the door, and huddled in her basement, listening as the deep hum and the faint clicking seemed to circle her home for whole. In the morning, she went outside, half expecting to find nothing. But there were signs. In the area where she had seen the moving lights, she found strange, geometric patterns in the dirt and leaf litter. Not carvings, but arrangements, circles of perfectly stacked stones, spirals drawn in the soil, lines of fallen branches arranged at perfect right angles. It was the work of an intelligence, but one with a logic she couldn't begin to comprehend. Alyssa was a scientist, a person who believed in evidence and rational explanations. But what she experienced had no place in any textbook. She had come to the woods to study life, but she had stumbled upon something that felt like its antithesis. She abandoned her homestead that week, leaving her dream behind, driven out not by a person or an animal, but by a sound, a light, and the terrifying realization that some parts of this world are governed by rules we will never understand. For our final story, we journey to the vast, isolated wilderness of northern Ontario, Canada. This account comes from a man named Frank, a seasoned hunter and trapper who had spent his entire life in the woods. Frank was not a man who scared easily. He knew the difference between a bear and a moose in the dark. He could identify a predator by its tracks alone. This is what makes his story so utterly terrifying. He saw something he could not identify, something his lifetime of experience told him should not exist. Frank had a small, rustic trapping cabin he used during the winter, miles from any town or road. One January evening, a heavy snow was falling. He was inside the cabin, warmed by his stove, cleaning his rifle. He had noticed something strange that afternoon while checking his trap lines. He'd found a set of tracks in the snow that had stopped him cold. They were bipedal, like a man's, but the stride was immense, nearly twice that of a normal person. And the print itself was wrong. It was too long, too narrow, and seemed to end in distinct, sharp claws that had dug deep into the frozen earth. He followed them for a quarter of a mile before they simply stopped in the middle of an open clearing. No tree to climb, no cave to hide in. They just ended, as if the creature that made them had vanished into thin air. Now, sitting in his cabin, the image of those tracks haunted him. Around midnight, his dog, a grizzled old sled dog named Coda, suddenly stood up, a low guttural growl rumbling in his chest. The hair on his back was raised. He stared intently at the cabin's single, heavy wooden door. Frank fell silent, listening. Over the sound of the wind, he heard it. A heavy, crunching sound in the snow outside. The sound of something massive, walking in circles around his tiny cabin. Frank grabbed his high-powered rifle, his knuckles white. Coda was now barking furiously, a sound of pure rage and fear. The crunching stopped directly in front of the door. There was a long, tense silence. Then, a loud sniff sound, like a huge animal inhaling, came from the other side of the door. It was followed by a deep, wet, guttural chuff. It was not the sound of a bear or a wolf. It was something else. Then came the scratching, a sharp, powerful clawing at the thick wooden door, splintering the wood. This was not an animal seeking shelter. This was a predator trying to get in. For what felt like a lifetime, Frank stood there, rifle aimed at the door, listening to this unknown thing clawing, sniffing, and occasionally bumping its immense weight against the cabin walls. He was trapped. He was miles from anyone. No one would even know he was in trouble until he failed to check in at the end of the week. He was entirely, completely on his own. He crept to the cabin's tiny, shuttered window. His hands shook as he slowly, quietly, opened the shutter just a crack, enough to peer outside. The moon was bright on the fresh snow, and what he saw would be burned into his memory forever. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by a large pine tree. It was tall, impossibly so, easily over 7 feet. Its body was gaunt, emaciated, with limbs that were too long and jointed at strange, unnatural angles. Its skin was a pale, grayish color, like old parchment stretched over bone. He couldn't see its face clearly, but he could see 2 small, faintly glowing points of light where its eyes should be. As he watched, it lowered its head and began to chew on the frozen carcass of a deer it had killed and dragged there. But it ate like no animal he had ever seen, tearing at it with a disturbing, methodical violence. Frank quietly closed the shutter, his mind reeling. He had spent 50 years in these woods and had never seen or heard of anything like it. This was a creature from a darker, older world. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, back against the far wall, rifle aimed at the door, listening to the creature circle his cabin until the first faint light of dawn. As the sun rose, the sounds faded away. When he was sure it was gone, he unbarricaded the door and stepped outside. The deer carcass was gone, but the tracks were everywhere. Long, clawed footprints circling his cabin again and again. And by the door, deep, gouged scratches in the wood, a permanent reminder of how close he had come to a horrifying death. Frank packed up his gear, left the cabin, and never went back. He knew that the wilderness he had loved his whole life was home to something he could never hope to understand, and that his tiny cabin was not a shelter, but a baited trap in the hunting ground of an ancient, unknown horror. The freedom of the wild comes with a price. It means leaving behind the safety net of society. These true stories are a chilling testament to the unique horrors that await in those quiet, isolated places. Whether the threat is a patient human predator, an incomprehensible natural phenomenon, or a creature from the darkest corners of folklore, they all teach the same lesson. When you choose to live off the grid, you are truly on your own. What do you think is the biggest fear of living off-grid? Share your thoughts or your own stories in the comments below. And if you appreciate these deep dives into true, unsettling events, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.